So the next two presentations concern civil rights, gender and disability. We have two distinguished speakers on this topic, Jane Connors and Freyja Haraldsdóttir. And their presentations will be followed by questions from Professor Rannveig Traustadóttir. Jane Connors is the former director of the Research and Right to Development Division at the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She worked in the United Nations from 1996, first as the chief of the Women's Rights Section in the Division for the Advancement of Women. Jane is going to discuss the United Nations obligations on political participation. Welcome, Jane.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to go on thanking everybody who is involved in bringing me here, thanking the sponsors and so on, but as we've heard, we've got very little time. But I'm really grateful to be here, very privileged to be here. I'm always very happy when women's suffrage is discussed, as it reminds me that South Australia, not many people know this, led the way in granting women the vote. That was followed by New Zealand, followed by Federal Australia. So the antipodes sometimes can get things right. Now, tomorrow, it will be 70 years since the UN Charter entered into force. It created a profound change in relations among states and their relations with individuals in their countries. The Charter's preamble begins unforgettably, "We the peoples of the United Nations." It reaffirms faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women. Two articles proclaim promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction, including on the basis of sex, as one of the United Nations purposes. This is modest, I think, from 21st century perspective, if we look back. But in 1945, this constituted the most forceful, legally binding international recognition of equality and non-discrimination in the enjoyment by individuals of human rights. It also formed the foundation of the international legal standards and institutions for the promotion and protection of human rights generally, including those of women and all others, such as children and persons with disabilities. The Charter's references to human rights are fleshed out in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It outlines a set of human rights and fundamental freedoms to which all are entitled without distinction of any kind, and provides that all are equal before the law and entitled without any discrimination to its equal protection. Where political participation is concerned, the Declaration proclaims that everyone has the right to take part in the government of his, and we have to thank Eleanor for that, it should be hers, country, directly or through freely chosen representatives, and that the will of the people shall be the basis of government authority, expressed through periodic and genuine elections by universal and equal suffrage. These provisions were translated into legally binding form into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966. Now, the Universal Declaration was the work of the Commission on Human Rights. It also prepared the majority of the 9 core United Nations human rights treaties. It has a sister body, the Commission on the Status of Women, and it focused on areas, and continues to do, where the Declaration's rights were not enjoyed fully by women and girls. Its work led to the adoption in 1952 of the Convention on the Political Rights of Women, which sought to equalize the very unequal situation of women and men in enjoyment and exercise of political rights, which was part of the post-World War II landscape. It provides that women shall be entitled to vote in all elections, be eligible for election to all publicly elected bodies, hold public office, and exercise all public functions on equal terms with men without any discrimination. The 1967 Declaration on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women developed these rights further. Now, neither that convention nor the declaration had an easy passage through the United Nations bodies. Many states resisted the concept of women's equality in general and in political rights in particular, and many were opposed to obligations requiring enactment of legislation to guarantee such equality. Even in states where there was no legal obstacle to women's enjoyment of political rights on the same basis as men, there was a vast gap between formal equality and its enjoyment. The persistence and indeed resurgence, and we're seeing resurgence today, of discrimination against women, despite the many legal texts concluded by the UN to ensure its elimination, inspired many women's rights activists, both within and outside government, and also within the UN itself, from all regions, backgrounds, and legal traditions, to demand an instrument which would expand on the Declaration's provisions and translate them into legally binding obligations. The path was long, arduous, and marked by potholes. Some of them were very deep and some of them very unexpected. But on the 18th of December 1979, the General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Unfortunately, on adoption, many states reserved on various parts of the treaty, including with regard to political participation, and these reservations were confirmed on accession or ratification, with a significant number being maintained by states today. The Convention is the very first international legal instrument to define discrimination against women. It makes clear that such discrimination can be purposeful or effective, and this underpins the notion of substantive equality. This means that a state's laws, policies, and programs, and its activities and those of its agents, must avoid direct or indirect discrimination against women. In addition, the state must also ensure that women enjoy in reality the same opportunities and privileges as men. The overarching obligation of the treaty is that states parties pursue without delay a policy of eliminating discrimination against women, and it identifies legislation and other measures required to achieve that end. These may include carefully designed temporary special measures, such as affirmative action, which can include quotas, aimed at accelerating de facto equality between women and men, and these are defined specifically as being non-discriminatory. Now, I'd love to talk about the Convention in greater detail because it's been part of my life for many, many years, and I feel very emotional when I talk about it. But let me highlight some of its significant elements. It obliges states parties to take all appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of women and men, to eliminate prejudices and customary and other practices based on the ideas of inferiority or superiority of either of the sexes, or on stereotype roles for women and men. That requires transformation of states, communities, and families so as to achieve full gender equality. It bridges human rights and development, especially through requiring states to take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against rural women. And this is Iceland, so rural women and women who work off the sea are, of course, included. It requires states to take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women by any person, organization, and enterprise. This pierces the public-private divide in terms of state obligation. And it also applies to discrimination in that most private of private spheres, marriage and family life. And it obliges states to eliminate discrimination against women and ensure their equality with men in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or other fields. And that confirms the universality, indivisibility, and interdependence of all human rights. The Convention's provisions on the elimination of discrimination against women in political and public life are strong. The provision is long, so I won't go into it in any detail at the moment. But today, suffice it to say that the Convention has 189 states parties. For Iceland, it entered into force in 1985, and its optional protocol, which allows for the receipt of petitions and conduct of inquiries, was accepted by Iceland in 2001. Now, the stragglers are interesting. They are the Holy See, Palau, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, Tonga, and the United States of America. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, assists states in implementation of this treaty through consideration of periodic reports. And Iceland's combined 7th and 8th report will be considered early next year, and I encourage you to pay attention to this. It also assists states parties through the consideration of petitions and conduct of inquiries. CEDAW makes clear that women and girls are not homogenous, and although the Convention addresses discrimination against women on the basis of sex, other factors, such as disability, may affect their enjoyment of human rights. It was, in fact, the first human rights treaty body to flag discrimination against women with disabilities in 1991. In all its work, its formulation of general recommendations, its work on report consideration, petitions and inquiries, CEDAW points out that in addition to suffering from discrimination directed against them as women, women and girls may suffer from multiple forms of discrimination based on additional grounds, such as race, ethnic or religious identity, disability, age, class, or being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or belonging to intersex communities. It also picks up on the particular issues confronted by refugee and migrant women. The Convention on the Rights of the Child was the first human rights treaty to address disability specifically, providing that states parties are to respect and ensure the rights in the Convention to any child within their jurisdiction without discrimination of any kind, including disability. And there is a specific provision relating to children with disability within the Convention. In 2008, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its optional protocol entered into force. This convention was spearheaded by disability activists, many with disabilities, and they pioneered that phrase, "Nothing about us without us." It is not a feminist phrase. Well, it is a feminist phrase, but it is a phrase of the disability movement. This creates a paradigm shift in how we think about disability. It moves from the notion of a medical approach to entitlement. Its preamble recognizes that women and girls with disabilities are often at greater risk, both within and outside the home, of violence, injury, abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment and exploitation, and emphasizes the need for a gender perspective in efforts to promote the full enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms by persons with disabilities. And it also points out in its Article 6 that women are subject to multiple discrimination and binds states to take appropriate means to eliminate this. Its provision on political participation or participation in political and public life requires states to guarantee persons with disability political rights and the opportunity to enjoy them on an equal basis with others, and sets out the means to achieve this, including through measures to ensure accessibility in voting, if necessary, through assistive and new technologies. This convention has 159 states parties, and that 159 does not include Iceland. I'm confused by this, and I would love somebody to tell me why. Now, in the 100 years after women in Iceland over 40 were granted the same suffrage rights as men over 25, where are we now? You've heard where we are from the speaker who opened this morning. 22% of all national parliamentarians are women. This is an increase of 11.3 from 1995. There are 11 women heads of state and 13 women heads of government. And in 37 states, women account for less than 10% of parliamentarians, and in 6 chambers, there are no women at all. There is good news. We all know about Rwanda. It has the highest number of women parliamentarians worldwide, and we know that women's participation in local government has improved. And I think I'm the fourth person to talk about how Iceland has been classified by the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index as being on the top in terms of eliminating the gender gap. But these figures emerge from a very simple cut. Women compared with men, and also they don't tell the whole story. They don't take account of issues such as disability, ethnicity, and age. And we don't have official statistics on, for example, the political participation of women with disabilities. But there are some figures on gender disparities. In terms of their political, in terms of they're twice as likely to experience gender-based violence than their sisters, and as made clear in a petition decided by CEDAW last year, frequently stereotypes and other barriers stand in their way if they complain. I'd like to the Convention and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has pointed out that people with intellectual disabilities are at particular risk with regard to their political rights, their voting rights. And in 2013, it considered a case where 6 people were removed from the electoral register because they'd been judicially placed under guardianship. And this, the committee concluded that this was discriminatory and a breach of the obligation that the state adapt its voting procedures to be appropriate, accessible, and easy to understand and use, and where necessary, allow persons with disabilities to be assisted if they so wish. Now, I'll take 1 minute. We know that the cost of exclusion and violence against women and girls with disabilities in any country is high, both financially and socially. Discrimination on any grounds is an obstacle to democracy, full citizenship, economic development, and erodes societies. And discrimination against the most vulnerable and excluded is especially divisive. Iceland's come a long way in the 100 years since those women over 40 were granted suffrage. It's a country at the forefront of human rights promotion and protection. It would be great if Iceland joined the party and became party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I encourage you to push it to do so. Thank you.